We know the post-lunch sessions can sometimes be a bit difficult, so we have a extremely exciting and energetic panel lined up for you now. This is on a topic that has been a priority for the Indian G20 this year, as well as for the Think 20. It's reflected in our communique, as well as across our task forces. And this panel is titled Women-Led Development, Scripting New Narratives. I request the panelists to come on stage as I call out your names. Maria Fernanda Espinosa, Executive Director, GWL Voices, and former President of the 73rd session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Tetsushi Sonobe, Dean and CEO, Asian Development Bank Institute, and the Chair for Think 7 Japan. Sachi Bhalla, Senior Program Officer, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, India. Stephanie Deepaween, Senior Research Fellow, Overseas Development Institute, UK. And to chair this session, Shamika Ravi, Member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, India. Over to you, ma'am.
So, namaskar. Good afternoon, everyone. No pressure at all. This is meant to be a very scintillating, exciting session. Thank you, Pramit. Well, this is a special session, I'm told, and we want to make it special, first of all, by telling you that it's not always women talking about women, amongst women, to women. We're very privileged to have Dean Sonobe as a affirmative action candidate but Dean, in no way is that meant to, we are very proud to have you amongst us. You've already heard the introductions. Well, I was the chair of W20 Communique Drafting Committee, and very proud to report that, you know, we actually got a consensus at a time when getting consensus on anything is very difficult, let alone on issues pertaining to women. And the W20 as an engagement group has a very vast mandate. But women-led development as a phrase is something now, increasingly it is getting imbibed in the day-to-day policy shaping, policy making process, not just within the country, but we're also socializing the idea through our own research and writing. Now, in the W20, women-led development, we try to narrow it down to 5 key areas. Climate change appeared to be the most important, largely on account of the fact that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one family, one earth, you know, the whole philosophy behind India's presidency has to do with global public goods. Climate is one of our biggest concerns and a common concern today. So climate change and women's role as far as climate is concerned ranked amongst the topmost. Women's entrepreneurship and what needs to be done to promote it became another focus area. Digital divide as far as gender is concerned is very real, and I highly recommend that you go through the communique because it goes, you know, the recommendations are very specific and action-oriented. We have grassroots leadership, and that is something that does distinguish the Indian presidency from the past ones as well. While remember G20, the presidency shifts from country to country, but the agenda is really common, and it has to be made common and go across presidencies over the years. Grassroots leadership took various different forms. It's not just about political participation, it's about women at the leadership table, decision-making table, as far as digital policy making is concerned, climate change policy making is concerned. Women are disproportionately more impacted by a lot of these exclusion realities that we live with. And finally, education, skill, and labor market participation. So those are the 5 key areas. And each of them, surprisingly, health emerged as a common cutting theme across all of this. So we will talk about each of these areas within this panel. But let me start by first asking our panelists to tell us that what does women-led development mean to you? And Dean Sonobe, if I may come to you first, please.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely privileged to be the, a part of this wonderful session with distinguished co-panelist and the moderator. So human-led development is, among the development economists like me, it's a kind of common sense now, because evidence, empirical evidence has accumulated to support this kind of hypothesis that many aspects in economic development and social development, women empowerment is very useful and important. And then as the economy grows, and then the women's kind of power increases, and then that results in many good benefits, bring various benefits to society, and also more actively, empower the women's. Then that will result in the more economic development and social development. And then I was given the 3 questions, and then among the first one among those 3 was, how can public and private institutions actively promote women's leadership in business, policy, and politics? And then this is a difficult question, because both demand side and supply side, the many factors are interacting. But demand side means maybe the incumbent bosses, many of them are still male, and they tend to think, oh, my successor they should be female, but unfortunately, female, management ability or leadership ability may be weak. So that kind of prejudice is a problem, or main problem of demand side. But the problem also exists on the supply side. So females may be, reluctant to take, leadership position. There will be many reasons. Lack of, if the women behave like a very strong leader, then the popularity may not be very high, and that kind of thing. But many potential candidates for leadership positions among females tend to say that the problem lies in the shortage of the same gender, role models, or mentors, or supports from outside. So that means they are actually willing, but facing difficulty. So that means some actions have to be made on maybe the demand side. So I think in short term, in short, one word, the maybe key would be quota. But in political world, it's very difficult, because those candidates for election always fight, competing with each other. So the male incumbent never say, yes, we will accept quota. So I think the easier place to make a first action would be academic world. So professors are easy to understand the necessity. So, and then maybe can be supportive. So in the academic world, including universities, research institutes, and think tanks, should try really hard and determined to increase improve gender balance, kind of aggressively. So as soon as I say think tank, it comes back to me. So I'm really worked hard to find a good female successor of myself, but I'm now succeeding. That's why, very happy thing to report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Sanabe. Well, as far as the quota or the demand and supply side that you explained, I think on the demand side, that is where policy comes in, that institutions are required. For instance, in India, we have 30% board membership mandatorily required to be of women. We started with quota for panchayat. Panchayat is the lowest level or the grassroots level of political representation. So we started with 30% women. Today we are 49%, Dean, without a quota. And all it took was 20 years, 25 years. Now, that might seem like a lot to the younger people in the room, but to the older people, seeing that kind of a huge churn and creation of a pipeline. So the pipeline gets created also on account of when the positions are created, the pipelines emerge. And today, unlike many of the OECD countries, a large democracy like India, we have had a bottoms-up approach to grassroots leadership. So a lot of these leaders who have emerged at the panchayat level are now actively contesting elections at the legislative as well as the parliament level. So that becomes one sort of empirical evidence for why what you suggested actually can work and has worked here. The second is the literature from corporate finance. When some of the Scandinavian countries went from 4 or 5% board members of women, overnight they went to 40%. This was the big fear that where will we find so many women directors? But there was also an empirical line of inquiry that what is it doing to the governance of the firm? Is it affecting the performance of the firm if suddenly you have lots of candidates who were not deemed fit until yesterday? And the literature there is actually quite robust. Corporate finance literature has decisively shown that while the performance of the firm did not vary very much in terms of the finances, but governance improved significantly, which means the CEO compensation was more closely tied with performance of the firm. They had more and minuted meetings and different other benchmarks for what is good governance in corporate finance. So what you have suggested, I think we have evidence, both from politics as well as from finance, that what you suggest actually can work, and we should continue to push for creation of the pipeline of women leaders. Sachi, what does women-led development mean for you?
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Ravi. I think it's really exciting to see this shift from women's development, women being seen as beneficiaries, to this shift towards women-led development. And I think it's quite clear to all of us, and I'm sure I'm speaking to a room of the converted, the importance of sharing perspectives of 50% of the population. The importance of having lived experience represented in leadership, and really sort of moving to see women setting the agenda for women's development. So it is a real evolution, I think. We've moved from passive recipients of development to seeing, to an environment, to a policy environment, a real grassroots environment where women are setting the agenda. You spoke a lot about the grassroots leadership. Some of the work that we've been supporting and learning from across the country is when women panchayat leaders start participating actively, from the point where you come up into public spaces for the first time to really now setting the agenda for the Gram Panchayat, you see improvements in health. You see improvements in nutrition. You see improvements in girls completing education. You see the stopping of early marriage of girls. And I think that is just so powerful in itself as a statement, because you are really seeing what women-led development means in practice. The second thing that I did want to sort of comment on was the importance of data. And you spoke about the, how corporate governance is improving. And I just say that also learning from the W20, the importance of sex disaggregated data to guide everything that we are doing. The Gates Foundation CEO, Mark Sussman, wrote about what he calls streetlight moments. And I think it's a really nice example to showcase how things change once you start looking at data from a gender perspective. And so his point was that if I had to think about street lighting, how am I going to use the budgets that are available to me, and at what distance do I put street lights? And if you ask a woman and you ask a man, their perspectives will be very different, because a woman is thinking about what are dark spots or safety, or whether she'll be able to travel down a road at night herself. And so the use of budgets or the use of or how you plan urban development, for instance, or rural development for that matter, will look very different when you start looking at data from a gender lens. So maybe for opening remarks, I'll stop there, but just to sort of highlight the importance of sex disaggregated data.
Very nice. Thank you so much for bringing that up. In fact, the second bullet of the W20 communique has to do exactly with this, which is we need gender disaggregated and gender sensitive data. And that is because it's like we will only respond in policy if we have a means of knowing what the extent of the problem is. So in as many activities, in as many areas of the economy and policy, if we can have gender disaggregated data, we're just able to define the problem better and think of better solutions. So it's a very important, and I must also say that was one part of the overall agenda where there was 100% agreement from day zero. Every country, member country, believed that we do need this kind of initiative, and we need to do it in a very structured format so that annually we also put together a report of how much of our data are we really presenting in the form of gender disaggregated form. So that is an excellent, thank you for bringing that up. Ms. Maria Espinosa, what does women-led development mean for you?
Thank you, Shamika, and thank you for the incredible W20 communique, which I have looked at carefully. And when you ask me what women-led development means, I think it means what we have experienced today and yesterday, which is practically, all women panels to speak about macroeconomics and the reform of the international financial architecture. Is practically all women speaking about new technologies, digital inclusion, and artificial intelligence. Basically, women-led development is when we understand that all issues are women's issues. And I think that was the big lesson learned of the whole G20 process that has been so inclusive and has brought together so many voices. And I think that the main question that brings us together is how to craft new development models that are sustainable, that are low in carbon and high in equality and inclusion. I think that's why we're all here. And when we say equality and inclusion, of course, we are speaking about 50% of the world's population. In 50% plus of the world's population should not only have the same rights, the same income, the same opportunity of living well, but it should also mean the same opportunities to be in places of decision making and actively engage in public life. And when you say this, it seems like it's not rocket science. It's obvious common sense, as you said. And we know that it makes demographic sense, it makes economic sense, it makes political sense, it makes environmental sense. And we all know that when women are treated fairly in a society, the society is healthier, more prosperous, more equal, economies work better. And it's not only an issue of having the numbers right, it is an issue of quality, of our societies and our economies. And you were so right, women-led development is a paradigm shift altogether. Because it's not only, about having the numbers right and having access to financial services and credit and here and there, and perhaps a little more spaces and seats in local governments. It is about truly power sharing and equal opportunity. That's why it's not as easy as it sounds. And I think that we have to acknowledge here that we are experiencing a gender and women's rights backlash. And we are seeing this in the international scene. We're seeing this in many countries, even in the so-called developed world. In Europe, let's look at what has happened in the latest election processes, that, you know, women and women's rights and gender equality, you know, have become a political battlefield. And in too many parts of the world, being a woman has become a risk, a liability. And not only in terms of their social and economic rights and labor rights, or access to financial services, etc., but also on political and civil rights. And I think that we need to acknowledge that and understand how important this G20 process has been. And I think we need to continue to mind the gap, because basically we are underrepresented in all spaces. In terms of the workforce, in terms of the pay gap, in terms of financial services, in terms of access to education, the digital gap, you know, you name it. But we are overrepresented in underpaid or unpaid work. And that's why the care economy needs to be defeminized and needs to be professionalized. And basically, what we are negotiating here, and it's not as easy as it sounds as common sense, it's because we are negotiating not only macroeconomic stability or climate stabilization, we are negotiating lifestyles, and we are negotiating who is going to broker and who is going to give up power and privilege, and where do us women stand in this brokering exercise. And basically, just to close here, this session is called New Narratives. And I think that, of course, to speak about women-led development is a new narrative. But beyond all, I think the new narratives have to start by saying women are not vulnerable, we are not vulnerable, we are powerful and resilient, but our rights have been undermined and we need to fight back on that. Number two, we cannot sit and relax because women's rights have not been incremental for improvement. There are huge ups and downs. We are experiencing a down moment as well, and we have to be aware of that, make visible that, and curve, you know, all the gaps we are continue to experience. Number three, as I mentioned at the beginning, all issues are women's issues. Science, technology, economics, politics, geopolitics, peace, and security are women's issues. And I think that we need to integrate women in a horizontal and vertical way in the things we do. So it should be a separate and standalone issue, so we can highlight things that are going well and not that well, but also, you know, horizontally, the cross-cutting part. And I think that if we look carefully to the to-do list that is present in the communiqué and the T20 communiqué, basically, and perhaps in a second round I'll be more specific, I think that we need to look at the recommendations and unpack the complexity to make implementation easier from an action-oriented accountability perspective. And you know, and to understand what are the institutional transformations that we need, what are the policy and legal and behavioral transformations that we need, and at what level. And of course, there are critical issues that perhaps I would like to take up in the second round on affirmative action on policy frameworks to equalize women in the world of work, et cetera, but there's so many raw material that we have now in our hands, and we need to make it happen to improve the life, the dignity, and the rights of women, especially in underprivileged parts of the world that do not happen only in the South, but also happening big time in the North. Thank you, and over.
Very well said. Stephanie, what does women-led development mean for you?
Thank you. Okay, this is on. Yeah, so actually I want to reflect on that question and maybe take you up on some of the specifics and think about reflecting on women's-led development within the context of the digital divide, coming from my place on Task Force 2, which is looking at our public digital infrastructure and our common digital future. So I think it's really interesting when we look from the context of women, the sort of challenges of digital technology are heightened and like quite illuminated. So we see when we look at women, the challenge of the digital divide in terms of access and use of technologies. It's clear that as things improve for women in terms of mobile access, internet access, access to digital financial services, it's always a step behind men. And there's multiple reasons for this we can get into around access, economic resources, trust in financial institutions, in all sorts of different ways. But there's this constant, when access is a challenge, it often tends to be harder for women. We also see challenges around technology in terms of the technology itself and ingrained bias. There's a lot of studies that have been done that if we look at how, for example, large language models operate or how different forms of AI operate, they operate on existing data that comes from the world. And in a world where women have been associated with certain roles, there are certain expectations of women, that is going to be reflected in the data because that's the data we're using, and this is informing the design of our technology and its use. And then third, we also see the challenge around use. Well, when women have access to technology, when they use it, we see, for example, around female politicians, an increase in harm, and huge harm in online violence against women as well. So again, the challenges are heightened when we look from the perspective of women. And I think when we look from that side, it can be quite overwhelming and give us a much bigger picture of what we're facing here as we're trying to provide for more inclusive development. But I also see the opportunity with this shift to women-led development to think of these challenges and then think in different ways about then what it might take to move beyond them. And again, there's sort of three things I want to pull out here that I see as important to thinking about what these new narratives might be in this context. The first is stepping back from, again, just looking at women in terms of consumers or use, but thinking about women across positions of leadership in companies, thinking about the design of technology, thinking about the testing of it, thinking about the work around technology, and thinking about the use. So a much more holistic picture of women and how they intersect across the different dimensions in which people interact with technology. The second, as has been brought up as well too, is that we need narratives that are intentional. Bias is ingrained in the data that we're using in technology. We can't just sort of sit back and assume that is going to eventually become more equal. We need to be proactive. I mean, we need to make it visible. The bias is going to be there. We need to expect it, and we need to make that our starting point. And then the third aspect of this narrative I want to comes up to this point again about data, but a sort of a different side to thinking about data and new narratives around women. And this is around thinking about not just sex-segregated indicators, but also what indicators are we using? What do they represent? And what do they represent? So for example, one thing we see around digital technology is who is missing from data, who is not seen, especially as we're trying to think about the lives of different women, who's not present. And when they're not present, if data is then informing decision-making, whose lives and experiences are not informing decision-making as we become increasingly digital, and being active and explicit to thinking about who isn't represented in our indicators. And then the last point is to think about where do our indicators get us? Yes, we need more women in leadership positions. Yes, quotas are important, but they're important because they, in this moment, they're a step towards a better world for women now, but also I sort of see an opportunity that these indicators are also creating a world where we might see the possibility of changes in norms. So it's not just about reaching it now, but it's an ongoing battle and thinking how do we lay a framework to make things better now, but also that in the future, the biases that we're seeing in technology are not the biases of society, and taking our indicators of substantive conditions for women as a step towards that future.
Fantastic, thank you. Perhaps now I'll go backwards, Stephanie, so just hold on to your microphone. And here, we will give 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So limit yourselves to 30 seconds. Tell us a little bit about AI and how the algorithms, give us an example of why intervening at this stage becomes very important strategically, because the existing algorithms are extremely biased, and they're likely to perpetuate the biases that exist. Give us some examples.
Yeah, I mean, so I'd say it's important to intervene now for two reasons in AI. The first is that as technology becomes more complicated, it becomes harder to see the bias. So we know it's going to be there around women. How do we build in an understanding of what is being produced? A lot of the creators, as far as I understand, of new generative AI don't know why it produces certain results. And so we can't just be reactive. We have to be thinking proactive. And what types of transparency do we need? And then the second is because the technology is already being used. So I know in the context of the UK where I come from, forms of AI are used in some ways in predictive policing, so determining where police officers should go to which neighborhoods, decisions about some sort of parole decisions sometimes among some certain areas as well. So it's being used. We know it has bias. We don't always know why it has bias, and so therefore it's critical that we're thinking about this now.
You know, one example that emerged after the COVID pandemic is effectiveness of certain medical devices. Because the testing had only been done on white males, the basic efficacy or how effective it was vis-a-vis women, you know, that gap started to emerge. So, you know, something very basic, which again sounds commonsensical from where we are talking about. In reality, a lot of these ingrained biases that exist within the system, for instance, of trials and how authorization, et cetera, is given, or how existing algorithms are produced, et cetera. I think the active intervention at this stage becomes very important. Maria, if I may come to you, given your background, and you've been in position of leadership, from political representation, what do you think? Our quotas are only, is that where we rest all our expectations, or do we go beyond quotas?
Well, I have to say that I used to be among the ones saying we don't need quotas, it's about meritocracy. And now I understand that it's about power and power sharing. That therefore we need quotas, we still need quotas, and I hope we reach you know, the ideal moment where we don't need quotas, but we do need affirmative action and we do need quotas. Let me do a little ad here. GWL Voices, the organization I lead, we just came out with a report called Numbers Matter, and we looked at the history of UN and multilateral organizations throughout history. And we discovered that only 1/3 of these organizations have been led by women throughout history. In that 13 of these organizations have never had a female leader. And 5 of them had a female leader once, but never repeated again. It means that if we want to change things, it also has to happen at the multilateral level, and it's not going well. And I am here as former president of the UN General Assembly. We have had 4 women presidents in 70 years of history, all of them from the Global South, and the first ever from India. You know, which I admire. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit was the first one. I was the 4th one, the first from Latin America. And these are not only symbolic numbers issues, it's about quality of leadership. We have only 22 female presidents from 193 countries. 27% of parliamentarians are female, and the rest are still men. So there is a lot to do in political representation and political leadership. But that happens. We have seen what happened with New Zealand, recently with the Netherlands. The violence against women in politics is a major issue that we should address collectively.
Sachi, on development front, given your experience at the Gates Foundation now for some time, what are some of the, very quickly, what are some of the big initiatives as far as realizing this women-led development, the promise that holds?
I'll take just one example. The National Rural Livelihoods Mission in India. There are 90 million women who are collectivized in 9 million groups. And while the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, NRLM, some would argue started off as a livelihoods mission, as a savings and credits program, the sort of leadership and the sort of growth that you see coming out from NRLM, I think is amazing. And it's something that, you know, we want to make sure that we are able to learn better around and see how is it that there are lessons that can be shared with other countries as well. And so, some of the work that we've been doing is trying to understand what is it that actually makes a women's collective or a women's enterprise really successful. So we're talking about whether it is, are you profitable? How long are you able to run? How many more women are you actually providing livelihood opportunities to? And also, really interestingly, what are the other follow-on effects on development? And I'll speak to maybe, just so that we continue remaining action-oriented through this panel as well, just a few examples of what can be done, whether it is through preferential procurement policies and ensuring that women's enterprises get linked to other development programs, whether it is school uniforms being stitched and provided to public schools, whether it is running of hospital canteens or anything else. Of course, many governments and private sector organizations have preferential procurement policies, and so there are, how do you ensure that women's enterprises are even able to fulfill those orders? And maybe that requires a rethinking about what are the sectors in which women's enterprises are. And then just linking that back to credit and savings, how do you continue building productive assets? So there is a very strong financial, institutional, and architecture that is available. But how do you actually ensure, and we see this happening, you see it with the linkages between NRLM and the National Rural Employment Guarantees Program. You are sort of building on available capital, and you're able to create productive assets that are available not just to the woman who is, or the enterprise that is building it, but to the entire community. So I think our learnings have really been around that. You can maximize a lot of gain if you start thinking about how all of these pieces connect with each other, if you listen to the women themselves, and you actually are able to enable cooperation, and you're able to link up across levels, whether it is very local or global.
Dean Sonobe, you said a lot of it is common sense. Do you think it's time we define common sense? If it is so obvious, and this has been part of the learning also through the G20, and I'm sure we'll carry forth a lot of the problems that we have identified this year, next year within another presidency. Do you think, when you say public and private institutions, what can they do? Private institutions, as well as public institutions, unfortunately, will respond to legislations, will respond to policies. But if we go beyond what our legislations are going to be coercive in nature, are there certain kinds of initiatives you think industry can do without these legislations that are possible?
Yeah, eventually possible, and we have to make it possible. But how is, of course, a problem. But we need to accumulate data and evidence to persuade stubborn people. And then someone have to start those experiments. And then again, I think the academic world can be, forerunner, supporter of that kind of movement. And then actually there is already, there are lots of nice studies. And from those studies, what we have learned is the very importance of the kind of over the life cycle of the females. So there are lots of gender responsive and multifaceted support is needed. And if it's really gender responsive and multifaceted, it can be very, very effective, especially in some period within a life cycle, like adolescence, adolescent girls. They face kind of multiple problems. So if one problem is solved, but because of other problems, they may fail. So that's why multi-faceted support is needed. And then later on, they will be suffer from the unequal burden of care work. So lots of policy support is needed. And then there are some nice research studies about what kind of more concrete practices more effective. So that kind of knowledge is accumulating, but replicability or generalizability must be checked more and more in different settings to be more persuasive. And then later on, the kind of the stage when the women become a leader. So again, maybe a training and those things, not only skills, different skills, but the important one would be the non-cognitive skills, right? And emotional control and those things. So yes, I think eventually the private sectors really become really willing to do those things voluntarily, and they would lead. But I think the first step can occur from the academic world, and that's my hope.
Thank you, Jean. So basically that tells you government is a part of the solution.
Sure.
Industry, of course, is a major part of it as well. But there is a certain onus also on society as a whole. And I think this is where the civil movement, etc., will be required, particularly when it comes to the care economy. This is just one statistics that I want to put forth to you. This is the first time in history of mankind we have seen such large number of elderly die alone without a kin, meaning there's no family around. And clearly there is something large amiss. So this is also, I think, a platform where a lot of these difficult conversations will have to happen, because care as a very important part of the economy has very seldom been thought of as a strategy. And you know that the care economy overwhelmingly burdens women. Of course, children are a large part of it, but so are the elderly. Even for young economies like India, where the median age is 28, but we have over 120 million people above the age of 60. And as economies age, the care economy and the need to provide the infrastructure really also becomes a way of freeing up women and women's labor, which remains trapped and also valuable in the household. But I think the real value of it needs to also come in the form of exchange and something that, when you put a monetary value to it, unfortunately, it also becomes of value in the household. Therefore, while there are statistical exercises where we are trying to see what is women's contribution to the economy, there needs to be real change in the form of thinking about care economy. And in fact, this year's, not just the W20, but I think in general, across several working groups, we have had care. Care is like that elephant in the room which needs to be addressed repeatedly every time we speak about women and girls. So actually, Promit, do we have time for questions from the floor? Okay, we'll take 2 questions. If you could just quickly identify and ask whoever you want to. Yes, please. We'll take one from the right side and one from the left. Yes, please.
I'm Jacqueline Kitulu. I'm from Kenya. I am a medical doctor, and I chair the board of a digital health startup. And I'm really excited to hear this conversation. And what struck me was something mentioned by Sanobe about the supply side and demand side, and that there's is a contribution from private sector philanthropists in the context of building up that supply side. So focusing on women in middle management, building them up into senior leadership positions, because even all the things that you're saying, you have to have the women willing to step into that space. So one such being Women Lift Health. I'm from the health background, but Women Lift Health with cohorts in North America, in India, in East Africa, now going on to South Africa. I think those are efforts that need to be built up, and building structures of building women in terms of the context of not just that women leadership is different, but how do you build that up into contributing then into growing, women economically and benefiting everybody. Yeah, just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So I am Achyut Rao. So my question is to Stefan ma'am. So ma'am, as you talked about AI, so in the future, will AI be the helping hand, a support, or a threat to the human existence? So this is my question.
Thanks. No small question at all. I mean, I think I would say I think there's a lot of reason for both optimism and concern. I think we're still figuring out the potential of what it is, and I think it's very difficult when technology is new to, one, understand what its use is going to be, how people are going to use it, and also what's significant. There's a lot of hype around cryptocurrency. It didn't necessarily go the way people thought. There's a lot of hype around generative AI. It seems to be going in a direction that is sort of profound in what it's producing. So I think I would say I'm quite nervous if we don't actually be more transparent up front, and if we don't find ways to be more proactive about addressing the potential harms and doing that together. Hence, having discussions like this at the G20 is critical because it has to be a global effort and it has to be inclusive of the global south. Can't be led just by the US and Europe. So I think really there is a lot of opportunity, but there's a lot of potential for concern, and that's why these conversations are so important.
Also, these are some of the most common problems, and actually that does transcend the usual divide of north, south, etc. These are problems that most governments are grappling with. But again, G20 becomes a very important platform where these can be voiced, and a greater call for transparency and sharing of know-how, also from a regulatory perspective, becomes important. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists. You were all exceptionally well-disciplined, stuck to your time. And thank you all for your patient hearing.
Big thanks to the panelists. Can you ask you to come to the front of the stage for a family photo? Can we have another round of applause for that, as advertised, exciting and energetic panel?